Welcome to Mass Obscurity. I'm Chewy, and this is fucking sacrilege. This is like the final nail in the coffin of a once great video game franchise. I love Final Fantasy. One of the first role-playing games I ever played was Final Fantasy VI. 3 US on Super Nintendo. I was introduced to it from a friend of mine. He had both 3 and 2, which are, I later found out, 4 and 6. Ever since then, role-playing games have really become my favorite type of game in the world, and I've loved Final Fantasy for a long time. Since I played Final Fantasy 3, I've played every other one that's ever been released here in the United States, with the exception of 12. When Dragon Quest VII came out, I decided to buy it on PlayStation 2. Pretty good game for what I can remember of it. It came with a demo of Final Fantasy 12. And after playing that demo, I decided Final Fantasy 12 was to be avoided like the water in Mexico. It was horrid. It was everything that Final Fantasy wasn't. What I later found out was that the man himself, Hironobu Sakaguchi, actually left Squaresoft. This was for a lot of reasons. One was because The Spirits Within movie bombed so bad at the box office that they didn't really want him touching anything after that. So he was kind of pushed back to figurehead status for all the Final Fantasies past 8. 9, 10, I guess that was it. 8, 9, and 10. He was just a figurehead at that point. So he got tired of it, wanted a more hands-on approach, so he left Squaresoft and founded Mistwalker Studios under Microsoft. They took Sakaguchi's vision. They took his great creation of Final Fantasy and just raped it. It's just nothing. It's a shell of its former self. The only thing this has in common with any of the other Final Fantasies is name. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, they left another guy in charge. A guy by the name of Motomu Toriyama. Now, I read in an interview a while back that Toriyama doesn't play role-playing games. Why would you put that person in charge of the world's biggest name in role-playing games? I don't get it. I recently read in an interview about Final Fantasy XIII that he was trying to make it more like Western role-playing games. And the two he cited were Tomb Raider and Hitman. Role-playing games. Now, I suppose if you take a very loose translation of the term role-playing game, then yeah, I suppose you're playing the role of Lara Croft or Agent 47, but that's not really the definition of a role-playing game, especially not a Japanese role-playing game, which is what I know and love from the Final Fantasy series. Why is Final Fantasy XIII not like any of the others? Well, there's a lot of reasons. First off, the biggest problem I have with it is the characters. They're trying to tell a story. To tell a story accurately, you have to make people sympathize with and care about the characters. I don't give a shit about the characters in Final Fantasy XIII. At all. The main character, Lightning, is a fucking bitch. If you're gonna get me into a story and interested, don't make your main character an unrelatable fucking asshole. Because I don't like that. Why would you follow the story of a character that you don't like? I like the character Snow better than her, and he's only in about a third of the game. As far as characters go, what about character selection? Alright, in Final Fantasy IV, you've got 10 characters. You only get a few at a time. You can only have 5 in your party at any given time, but there's 10 different characters that are in your party throughout the game. Final Fantasy V, yeah, they only have 4, but you get to change their jobs to something like 20 different job classes, which kind of creates different characters, or the feel of it anyway. Final Fantasy VI has 14 different characters, any of whom you can have as a main character, all of whom have interesting backstories, all of whom you care about if you take the time to learn about their backstories. Final Fantasy VII started to pull back a little bit. They gave you 9 characters, which isn't bad. I mean, the characters were all still pretty interesting. They had backstories, you know where they came from, where they were going. Yeah, except for Cloud. He was a little bit, even to this day, after 3 Final Fantasy VII games and a movie, I still don't know whether Cloud really didn't remember who he was at the beginning of the game or was just flat out fucking lying to everyone. If he was just lying to everybody, don't really like him as a main character, because, as I said, that's pretty unrelatable if your character's a lying dickhead. Final Fantasy VIII had 6 characters. Starting to slow down. The thing that really killed Final Fantasy VIII was its battle system, though. I'm not going to go into that right now. The characters were glancingly interesting. Final Fantasy VIII's kind of where it started to fall apart. Final Fantasy IX, you had 8 main characters. I didn't really get into Final Fantasy IX much. I only completed it once, and it felt like it was geared toward a younger audience than me. I was graduating high school at the time, so I didn't really go for the little cutesy, cartoony graphics. Not that it was a bad game, I just couldn't really get into it for some reason. Some of the characters were interesting, but some of them were the mystical, characters without a history that kind of lost the trail of the story for me. Final Fantasy X had 6 characters. Which wasn't too bad. I actually liked Final Fantasy X, and this is where I'm going to have to disagree with Spoony from Blistered Thumbs. It wasn't a bad game. Tidus, the main character, and yes, it's pronounced Tidus. I saw it in an interview before the game came out because Christopher Titus had his TV show on at the time. But, yes, he's a whiny little bitch that looks like Meg Ryan. But beyond that and the goofy clothes that the characters wear, Spoony really doesn't have a reason to bitch about anything. Don't get me wrong, I like Spoony, I enjoy his videos, but I thought Final Fantasy X was the last good one. Final Fantasy XI, online, MMORPG. Horrible. Horrible. I tried getting into it 3 times. Never made it past level 7. It couldn't keep my interest. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. There wasn't anybody to help me. There's no tutorials. There's no map guidance. There's no marking where you're supposed to go next or who you're supposed to talk to. You can't track your quests. I didn't know what the hell I was doing most of the time. Final Fantasy XII, as I said, was a horrible abomination of shit that should be avoided like the Black Plague. Final Fantasy XIII, pretty much the same thing. For the whole first 4 hours of the game, it has no role-playing elements at all. You don't get any choices. You don't get to upgrade your characters. Your characters don't gain levels. Well, your characters don't gain levels in the entire game, but your characters don't gain stat increases for the whole first 4 to 6 hours of the game. And it's just, it may as well be a 4-hour cinematic. The battle system is completely unengaging. All you have to do is hit auto battle. The entire game. That's all you have to do. Sit there and go like this. That's how you play your battles. There's no choices. If you try and make choices, you're going to be killed. It takes too much time to make your choices. Your enemies get to attack, and the longer it takes you to choose your choices, the more attacks your enemies are going to get before you get to do anything. So you may as well just hit auto battle the entire time, because it's supposed to optimize what you're doing in battle anyway. So the game plays itself. There's no choice in where to go. This is my biggest problem with Final Fantasy XIII, the linear path. Now, the creators of the game, the developers and things, have defended this, saying that no Final Fantasy in the past has truly been open world. It hasn't been infinite choices. That's not what we as players want. We don't want a Final Fantasy that's like Elder Scrolls, You know, I mean, if they want to make a Final Fantasy that's a lot like Oblivion, I'm not going to bitch about it. An open world game like that, great. I love those type of games. Oblivion, Fallout, Red Dead Redemption, I don't have a problem with those. They're great games. It's not the feel of a Final Fantasy though. But that's not what any Final Fantasy before has been. They've all been a maze of choices, a maze of paths, a maze in a dungeon. There are choices. Most of them don't go anywhere. There is one choice that advances the story and gets you to where you're going. If that's what you mean by linear, fine, but that's not the definition of linear. You have these choices. Granted, they don't generally go anywhere, maybe to a treasure, maybe to a secret passage, who knows, but at least they're there. In Final Fantasy 13, you don't have those choices. There are no side paths anywhere. It's one path from point A to point B. It's like, why am I even playing this if I'm just going to be holding forward the whole fucking time? I don't want my characters to run in a straight fucking line for 48 hours. That's the other thing. I got through the first disc of this game. This game has 3 discs on Xbox 360. I got through the first disc in under 12 hours. I got to the third disc in under 24 hours. For a Final Fantasy, that is a fucking shame. It took me about 24 hours to get off the first disc of Final Fantasy VII. Come on, guys. If you're going to add content, add content.